Divorce papers smell exactly like cold toner and stale desperation. When Arthur pushed the manila folder across the chipped laminate table, he didn't look at Nora's eyes. He looked at the frayed hem of her flannel shirt. He was trading a decade of shared electric bills and cheap pasta for a woman whose last name was printed on hospital wings. He wanted out of the grind. He didn't know the woman he was leaving was about to buy the world. The refrigerator hummed, a rattling asthmatic sound that usually meant the compressor was failing again. Nora stared at the magnetic clip holding a past-due electric bill. Her eyes traced the red font. I'm exhausted, Nora." Arthur's voice didn't match the kitchen. The kitchen was all peeling yellow linoleum, the smell of burnt toast, and the damp, metallic tang of the rusted sink. Arthur's voice, however, sounded like it had already moved out. It was smooth, practiced, laced with a pity that made Nora's stomach twist into a tight, hard knot. She finally pulled her gaze from the electric bill and looked at her husband of 8 years. He was wearing a cashmere sweater. She hadn't bought it. The wool was a soft, pale gray that brought out the color of his eyes, an expensive contrast to the thrift store denim he usually wore. He stood near the doorway, keeping a careful distance. Like poverty was a contagion he was terrified of catching again. "Exhausted," Nora repeated. The word felt like sandpaper in her throat. She didn't yell. She didn't throw the half-empty mug of lukewarm coffee sitting between them. She just noted the subtle shift in his posture. "We're drowning," Arthur said, rubbing the back of his neck. The sleeve of the cashmere sweater pulled back, revealing a watch. Sleek, matte black, impossibly thin. Another thing she hadn't bought. "I'm 34, Nora. I spend my days crunching numbers for a logistics firm that doesn't know my name, and I come home to this." He gestured vaguely at the kitchen, but the gesture encompassed her, too. Her unwashed hair, the dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes, the permanent smell of commercial bleach on her hands from her second job, managing the night shift at the laundry facility. "And Beatrice isn't drowning?" Nora stated softly. Arthur flinched. He hadn't expected her to name it so bluntly. He expected tears, bargaining, a hysterical plea. Instead, she sat utterly still, a strange, suffocating numbness settling over her limbs. "It's not just about her money," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He shifted his weight, the soles of his new loafers squeaking slightly against the cheap flooring. She sees potential in me. She has a life that breathes. There's space, light. I can't suffocate in this apartment anymore, Nora. I'm sorry, I really am." He sounded like he was reading a script drafted by a PR firm. Nora wondered, absently, if Beatrice had coached him. "Be firm but gentle, darling. Break it clean." Beatrice, heiress to a shipping empire. Arthur had met her at a corporate charity gala he'd wormed his way into, a networking event that had served its purpose all too well. Nora looked down at her hands. The knuckles were red, the cuticles frayed. She felt a sudden, sharp spike of humiliation, not because he was leaving, but because he was right. They were drowning. The constant math of survival, choosing between the heating bill and groceries, the anxiety that flared every time the car made a strange noise. It ground you down into dust. He had found a ladder out of the pit. He was kicking it away as he climbed. "Leave the key," Nora said. "Nora, listen. Leave the key, Arthur." Her voice cracked, betraying the calm she was desperately trying to maintain. A hot prickle of tears threatened behind her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not here, not while he wore another woman's cashmere. Arthur sighed, a heavy, long-suffering sound. He reached into his pocket and placed his house key on the table next to the manila folder. The metal made a dull clink. "I've paid the rent through the end of the month," he said, stepping backward into the hallway. "My lawyer will handle the rest. I won't fight you for whatever is in the joint account." $342, Nora thought. How generous. The front door clicked shut. The deadbolt didn't engage. Nora sat in the silence of the kitchen for a long time. The refrigerator stopped humming, plunging the room into a heavy, suffocating quiet. She reached out and touched the metal of the key. It was still warm from his pocket. That was what broke her. Not the divorce papers, but the lingering warmth of the man who had just erased a decade of shared struggle. She leaned over the table, buried her face in her arms, and dry heaved, the raw, ugly sound tearing through the empty apartment. 6 days later, the smell of damp wool and ozone clung to Nora's coat as she pushed through the heavy glass doors of a building in the financial district. The rain outside was relentless, a freezing drizzle that seeped into her boots and turned the city into a smear of gray. She hadn't eaten anything but a piece of stale bread since yesterday morning. The nausea from the breakup hadn't subsided. It had just mutated into a dull, persistent ache in her gut. She had taken an unpaid morning off from the laundry facility to answer a certified letter that had arrived on day 4 of Arthur's absence. The letterhead belonged to Gable, Thorne and Associates, a law firm whose address commanded respect and demanded money. Nora assumed it was Arthur's doing. He was pushing the divorce through faster, trying to untangle himself completely. She approached the reception desk. The marble was spotless. The receptionist looked at Nora's dripping coat and scuffed boots with a micro-expression of disdain before directing her to the 34th floor. The elevator ride made her ears pop. When the doors opened, the air smelled like expensive leather and lemon polish. A man in a bespoke suit was waiting for her. He had silver hair, calculating blue eyes, and an expression of utter neutrality. "Mrs. Cole?" he asked. "Just Nora," she corrected, her voice raspy. She was already dropping Arthur's last name in her head. "I am Richard Gable. Please, come into my office." The office was cavernous, dominated by a mahogany desk that looked heavier than Nora's entire apartment building. Gable gestured for her to sit in a plush, wingback chair. Nora sat, perching awkwardly on the edge, hyper-aware of the damp stain her coat was leaving on the upholstery. "I don't have a lawyer," Nora started, preemptively defensive. "If this is about Arthur's terms, I already signed the papers he left. I don't want anything from him." Gable paused, his hands resting flat on a thick cream-colored dossier. He frowned, a slight creasing of his forehead. "Arthur, I apologize, Ms. Nora. I am not a divorce attorney. I am an estate executor." Nora stared at him. The ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the room suddenly sounded deafening. "Estate? My mother passed 5 years ago. I don't have anyone else." "You had a father," Gable said quietly. Nora's breath hitched. Harrison. She had never met him. Her mother had rarely spoken of him, only mentioning once, in a fit of bitter drunkenness, that he was a man who loved ambition more than he loved his own blood. Nora had grown up assuming he was a deadbeat, a ghost who had vanished into the ether. Harrison Vance passed away 2 weeks ago, Gable continued, his tone methodical. I am sorry for your loss, however abstract it may be. He died? Nora felt nothing, no grief, no sudden rush of mourning for a phantom, just a cold, blank confusion. Okay, why am I here? Gable opened the dossier. The paper made a thick, heavy sound. Your father was not an easy man. He was, however, a remarkably successful one. He founded Vanguard Holdings in the late 70s. It began in logistics, expanded into rare earth mining, and subsequently into technology infrastructure. Nora's brain felt like it was moving through wet cement. I don't understand. He knew of you, Nora. He tracked your life from a distance. He chose not to interfere, believing, perhaps misguidedly, that adversity builds character. Gable adjusted his glasses. But in his final will, executed just months before his death, he left the entirety of his controlling shares, liquid assets, and private real estate portfolio to his sole biological heir. Gable turned a piece of paper around and slid it across the mahogany expanse. You. Nora looked at the paper. There were numbers printed there. Too many numbers. The commas seemed to blur together, dancing on the stark white page like a cruel joke. 50 billion estimated valuation. This is a mistake, Nora whispered. The air in the room felt too thin. She pressed her hands against her thighs, feeling the rough denim of her cheap jeans. 50 million? Billion, Gable corrected gently. And that is a conservative estimate of the asset liquidation value. The liquid cash immediately available to you in the holding accounts is closer to 4.2 billion. Nora couldn't breathe. It wasn't a metaphor. Her chest seized. A high-pitched ringing started in her ears. The number was abstract, absurd. It was the GDP of a small country. It was an amount of money that didn't solve problems. It erased reality entirely. 50 billion. 6 days ago, her husband had left her because they couldn't afford a life that breathed, because the heating bill was a crisis, because he was tired of being poor. A hysterical, jagged sound tore out of Nora's throat. It started as a gasp and morphed into a laugh. A harsh, barking laugh that echoed strangely against the mahogany walls. She put her hands over her face, shaking violently. Gable sat perfectly still, allowing the shock to run its course. He had seen this before, though rarely on this scale. He poured a glass of water from a crystal carafe and pushed it towards her. "Breathe, Nora," he advised. She took the glass with trembling fingers, the cold crystal shocking her skin. She drank, the water tasting faintly of minerals. What happens now?" she managed to croak. "Now," Gable said, pulling a Mont Blanc pen from his pocket, "you sign a great deal of paperwork. We set up an immediate security detail. We establish a family office to manage the transition, and you decide what you want to do with the rest of your life." Nora looked out the floor-to-ceiling window. The gray city looked different now. It didn't look like a cage anymore. It looked like a chessboard. Arthur wanted a life that breathed. I'm about to own the air. 1 month later. The penthouse suite at the St. Regis smelled of fresh orchids and ozone from the heavy rain hammering the glass. Nora stood by the window, a mug of black coffee in her hands. She was wearing a pair of faded gray sweatpants with a small hole in the left knee. She could have bought a wardrobe of silk and vicuña, but she found a strange, grounding comfort in the frayed cotton. The transition hadn't been a montage of shopping sprees and champagne. It had been brutal, exhausting work. Gable had set up a war room in the adjacent suite. Nora spent 14 hours a day learning the anatomy of her inheritance. She learned how to read a balance sheet, how to differentiate between a hostile takeover and a strategic merger, and how to spot the difference between a sycophant and a competent advisor. She was imperfect at it. She snapped at accountants when the jargon became too dense. She suffered from profound imposter syndrome that kept her awake until 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling, waiting for someone to knock on the door and tell her the clerical error had been fixed and she needed to return to the laundry facility. But she was learning. The calluses on her hands were fading, replaced by the invisible callus of power. Her first act with her new wealth wasn't buying a yacht. It was quiet, petty almost. She bought the building she used to live in. She remembered the landlord, a greasy man named Miller, who refused to fix the heat in the winter and threatened eviction if the rent was 2 days late. Through a proxy shell company, Nora purchased the building at 20% over market value. Once the ink was dry, she fired Miller and transferred the deed to a nonprofit housing trust with strict stipulations. Rent was frozen indefinitely, and every apartment was to be fully renovated. It was a drop in the ocean of her wealth, but the feeling of signing that authorization wire was intoxicating. Nora, Gable's voice broke her reverie. He stood in the doorway of the living room, holding a tablet. He had become a fixture in her life, part mentor, part highly paid employee. "What is it, Richard?" she asked, not turning from the window. Down below, the headlights of cars looked like a river of blood and diamonds. "The acquisition of the Vanguard logistics arm by Kensington Shipping is complete," he said. Nora finally turned. Her heart gave a slow, deliberate thud. Kensington. Beatrice Kensington's family empire. Before Heiress and Cole died, he had set the wheels in motion to aggressively acquire a massive swath of Kensington's commercial routes. It was a hostile takeover masked as a merger, and it had been finalized yesterday. Nora now held a 40% voting stake in the company that Beatrice's father ran. "They're hosting a gala tonight," Gable continued, his voice neutral, but there was a faint, cynical glimmer in his eye. "To celebrate the merger. They believe Vanguard is still being run by the board of directors. The board has kept your identity anonymous, as requested." "Arthur will be there," Nora stated. It wasn't a question. "Arthur is currently employed as a senior VP of strategy at Kensington," Gable read from the tablet. "A title invented 4 weeks ago. Yes, he will be in attendance." Nora walked over to the mahogany coffee table and set her mug down. She picked up a heavy, embossed invitation card lying on the glass. Beatrice Kensington had sent it to the chief executive of Vanguard Holdings. Nora thought about the day Arthur left. She remembered the smell of his expensive cologne covering up his anxiety. She remembered the squeak of his loafers on the cheap linoleum. He had wanted the fast track. He had sold out his marriage for a seat at a table he didn't realize Nora now owned. "Richard," Nora said softly, running her thumb over the gold foil of the invitation. "Call the styling team, the ones you hired last week." "You want to attend?" "I don't want to attend," Nora corrected, a dark, complicated knot of vindication and sorrow tightening in her chest. "I want to arrive." 3 hours later, Nora stood in front of a full-length mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, yet undeniably herself. The stylist had chosen a gown of deep, midnight blue silk. It didn't scream wealth. It whispered it. No loud logos, no ostentatious jewels. Just the flawless architecture of the cut, hugging her frame perfectly. Her hair, previously limp and dull, was swept back in a sleek, sharp style. The only jewelry she wore was a simple diamond tennis bracelet on her left wrist, right over the spot where she used to burn herself on the industrial press at the laundry facility. The scar was still faintly visible beneath the stones. She looked at her reflection, feeling a sudden, acute wave of nausea. She was walking into a snake pit. Part of her just wanted to crawl back into her frayed sweatpants and hide. She was a fraud playing dress-up. No, she told herself, gripping the edges of the dressing table until her knuckles turned white. I am Harrison Cole's daughter. I hold $50 billion of leverage. They are the frauds. The ride to the museum where the gala was being held was silent. The interior of the Maybach was soundproofed, blocking out the sirens and the rain. Nora stared at the partition, her mind racing. She wasn't doing this to win Arthur back. The thought of his touch made her skin crawl. She was doing this for the Nora who had cried over a $300 electric bill. She was doing this to watch the illusion shatter. When the car pulled up to the red carpet, a phalanx of photographers was waiting, flashing strobes into the night. Gable's security team moved efficiently, forming a barrier. "Ready?" Gable asked from the seat next to her. Nora took a slow, deep breath, smelling the faint scent of rain and expensive leather. It didn't smell like cold toner anymore. "Let's go," she said. She stepped out into the flashes, her expression a perfect, impenetrable mask. The ascent up the marble stairs of the museum felt like walking to an execution, but she kept her chin high. Inside, the ballroom was a chaotic symphony of wealth. Clinking champagne flutes, the murmur of calculated conversations, the heavy scent of hothouse flowers and imported perfumes. Nora moved through the crowd like a ghost. People parted for her, sensing the gravity of the security detail and the sheer, unspoken authority she carried, even though they had no idea who she was. She spotted them near the ice sculpture in the center of the room. Beatrice was stunning, draped in emerald green, laughing brightly at a joke someone had made. And beside her, holding her champagne flute like an obedient servant, was Arthur. He looked polished, his tuxedo fit perfectly. But as Nora watched from the shadows of a marble pillar, she noticed the subtle tells. The way he shifted his weight constantly, the tight, strained smile. He was out of his depth. He was a shiny new accessory Beatrice had acquired, and the novelty was already wearing off. Beatrice's friends spoke over him. He nodded eagerly at things he clearly didn't understand. He looked exactly like a man who had traded his soul for comfort, only to find the comfort was a cage. Nora signaled the waiter, took a glass of sparkling water, and stepped out from behind the pillar. She didn't walk toward them immediately. She let the room do the work. Gable had stepped away to speak to the Kensington CEO, Beatrice's father. Within minutes, a ripple of whispers began to move through the ballroom. The Vanguard CEO was here, the anonymous buyer who now held the leash to the Kensington empire. Nora watched as Beatrice's father, a red-faced man with a thick neck, broke into a panicked sweat. He scanned the room, following Gable's discreet nod. His eyes landed on Nora. The entire dynamic of the room shifted, like water draining from a basin. Beatrice noticed her father's panic. She turned, her eyes following his gaze. Then Arthur turned. The moment Arthur's eyes locked onto Nora, the world seemed to slow down. He blinked once, twice, his brow furrowed in utter confusion. He took in the midnight blue silk, the security detail flanking her at a respectful distance. The way the wealthiest men in the room were looking at her with a mixture of terror and reverence. Nora didn't smile. She didn't glare. She simply held his gaze from 30 feet away, took a slow sip of her water, and let the crushing weight of reality settle onto his shoulders. Arthur's mouth parted slightly. The champagne flute in his hand tipped, spilling a few drops of pale gold liquid onto his expensive polished shoes. He knew. In that single, fractured second, looking at the cold, unyielding posture of the woman he had discarded like trash, Arthur understood exactly who had just bought his new life. The drop of champagne on Arthur's leather shoe caught the chandelier's light. It sat there, a tiny, trembling bead of gold, before soaking into the porous seam. Nora didn't walk over to him. She didn't have to. The gravitational pull of the room had already shifted, dragging the Kensington patriarch, Thomas Kensington, across the marble floor. He moved with the desperate hustle of a man whose empire had just been appraised by a pawnbroker. "Ms. Cole," Thomas said, his voice a gravelly rumble that lacked its usual boom. Up close, Nora could smell the sharp metallic tang of his anxiety sweat cutting through his sandalwood cologne. We weren't expecting the Vanguard chair. This is an honor, truly." Arthur was standing 3 feet behind Thomas. Beatrice had her hand on Arthur's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his tuxedo sleeve. Beatrice looked confused. Arthur looked like he was suffocating. His chest rose and fell in shallow, jerky movements. He stared at the diamond tennis bracelet on Nora's wrist. He knew the burn scar beneath it. He had kissed it once, years ago, in a kitchen that smelled of burnt toast, telling her they would make it out of the grind. "Mr. Kensington," Nora said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. It wasn't an act. It was the numbness returning, a thick, protective layer of ice over her nerve endings. "Richard speaks highly of your operations. We are thrilled about the synergy," Thomas practically babbled, gesturing blindly behind him. "My daughter, Beatrice, and my new senior vice president of strategy, Arthur." Arthur flinched at the sound of his own name. He stepped forward. His mouth opened. His throat worked, but the muscles seemed to have forgotten how to form consonants. "Nora," he breathed. It wasn't a greeting. It was a plea for reality to reassert itself. Beatrice's head snapped toward Arthur, her intricate updo bobbing. "You know each other?" "We are intimately acquainted with Mr. Cole's strategic foresight," Richard Gable answered smoothly, appearing at Nora's elbow like a well-dressed shadow. "Vanguard looks forward to auditing the new strategy division next week." Nora didn't look at Arthur. Not directly. She looked at Beatrice. The heiress had perfect skin, the kind that had never been exposed to fluorescent warehouse lights or the stress of a maxed-out credit card. Beatrice wasn't a villain. She was just a tourist who had picked up a stray dog, not realizing the dog belonged to the landlord. "I have an early morning," Nora said, addressing Thomas. She felt a sudden, violent exhaustion. The vindication was hollow. It tasted like ash. "Enjoy your evening. I'll see your executives on Monday." She turned and walked away. The crowd parted. She didn't look back. The ride back to the St. Regis was suffocating. Nora unclasped the diamond bracelet and let it drop onto the leather seat. It landed with a dull, heavy clatter. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes until sparks bloomed in the darkness. "You handled that flawlessly," Gable said, from the opposite seat, typing on his phone. "I feel like I'm going to throw up," Nora whispered. That is also a standard reaction to corporate acquisitions. When she reached her penthouse, she bypassed the bedroom and walked straight into the master bathroom. She turned on the shower, letting the water run scalding hot. She sat on the cold marble floor in her midnight blue gown, ignoring the way the water soaked the hem, ruining the silk. Her phone buzzed on the vanity. It buzzed again and again. She didn't need to look at the screen to know who was calling. Arthur was finally doing the math, and the math was destroying him. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her forehead against the damp silk. She didn't cry. The tears were dried up, replaced by a cold, hard knot of gravity settling in her stomach. She was no longer drowning. She was the ocean. Monday morning smelled like ozone and dry erase markers. The Kensington Shipping boardroom was perched on the 42nd floor of a glass tower. The table was a massive slab of live-edge walnut. Nora sat at the head of it. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that Gable's stylist had provided. It felt like armor. Across from her sat Thomas Kensington, looking 10 years older than he had at the gala. Beside him, Beatrice, acting as a board member, her usual radiant confidence replaced by a tight, brittle posture. And at the far end of the table, clutching a manila folder as if it were a life raft, was Arthur. He hadn't slept. The skin under his eyes was the color of bruised plums. The cashmere sweater was gone, replaced by a stiff, overly starched suit that swallowed his frame. He kept stealing glances at Nora, his eyes begging for a flicker of recognition, a hint of the woman who used to share his cheap pasta. Nora offered him the blank, unreadable stare of a spreadsheet. "Let's bypass the pleasantries," Gable said, standing near a digital projector. "Vanguard now holds a 40% voting block. We've reviewed the quarterly expenditures. There is a staggering amount of bloat in the newly formed strategy division." Thomas cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "That division is in its infancy. We are exploring new logistical routing. You are burning capital on hypothetical models," Nora cut in. Her voice was quiet, forcing everyone in the room to lean in to hear her. It was a trick Gable had taught her. Never raise your voice. Make them reach for your words. "I reviewed the proposal submitted by your senior vice president." She didn't look at Arthur. She looked at the tablet resting in front of her. "The routing model assumes a 30% drop in fuel costs that has no historical precedent," Nora continued, tapping the glass screen. "It's not a strategy. It's a wish list. It's fiction." Arthur's face turned the color of old chalk. The predictive algorithms suggest," he started, his voice cracking. "The algorithms are fed biased data," Nora interrupted, her tone flat, devoid of malice. That was what made it so brutal. If she had yelled, if she had shown anger, Arthur could have played the victim. He could have told Beatrice she was just a bitter ex-wife out for revenge. But Nora was speaking the cold, indisputable language of money. She was dismantling his professional worth piece by piece. "Ms. Cole," Beatrice spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. Arthur has a unique perspective. He came from the floor. He understands the granular level of logistics. He understands data entry, Nora corrected gently. She finally lifted her eyes and met Beatrice's gaze. I managed a commercial logistics facility for 6 years, Ms. Kensington. I know what the floor looks like. I know the smell of the diesel, the shift schedules, the union grievances. Your vice president does not have a unique perspective. He has a proximity to your family. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the faint mechanical hum of the air conditioning unit. Beatrice shrank back into her leather chair. The flush of humiliation crept up her neck. She looked at Arthur. She was looking at him not as a partner, but as a liability. The romantic illusion of the ambitious, misunderstood worker she had rescued was evaporating under the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom. Vanguard demands a restructuring of the executive branch, Gable announced, placing a single sheet of paper on the walnut table and sliding it toward Thomas. Redundancies must be eliminated to ensure our return on investment. Thomas looked at the paper. His jaw tightened. He didn't even look at Arthur when he spoke. Understood. Arthur stood up. His chair scraped violently against the carpet. The sound was loud and ugly. Nora, please, he said. The corporate mask cracked entirely. It was just Arthur now. Desperate, cornered Arthur. You can't do this. I'm not doing anything, Arthur, Nora said, closing her tablet. She felt a strange, detached pity for him. He looked so small. The market is simply self-correcting. She stood up. Gable handed her her coat. As she walked toward the heavy glass doors, Arthur's voice chased her. We were married. You can't just erase me. Nora paused with her hand on the cold steel handle. She didn't turn around. You left the key on the table, Arthur, she said to the glass. I just changed the locks. The rain in the city never seemed to stop. It washed the grime from the sidewalks, but left a pervasive, bone-deep dampness in the air. 3 weeks had passed since the boardroom massacre. Arthur had been quietly terminated, his severance package gutted by a non-disclosure agreement Thomas Kensington had forced him to sign. The society papers had run a brief, polite blurb about Beatrice Kensington's engagement being mutually dissolved to focus on philanthropic endeavors. Arthur had been discarded. The ladder he had climbed so ruthlessly had been kicked out from under him, and the fall had broken him. Nora was leaving a late dinner with Gable and 2 international investors. She stepped out of the private dining club in Tribeca, pulling the collar of her wool coat tight against the November wind. The security detail, 2 men in dark overcoats, flanked her immediately. Her driver was idling at the curb in the Maybach. Nora! The voice was ragged, torn by the wind and something heavier. Nora stopped. The lead security guard immediately stepped in front of her, his hand moving smoothly inside his coat. Stand down, Nora murmured, touching the guard's arm. Arthur emerged from the shadows of an adjacent alleyway. He looked terrible. The tailored suits were gone. He was wearing the old, frayed denim jacket he used to wear on weekends when they went to the laundromat. His hair was greasy, plastered to his forehead by the drizzle. He smelled faintly of stale beer and desperation. He stopped a few feet away, held back by the sheer physical presence of the security detail. They froze me out, Arthur said, his chest heaving. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched. Bea wouldn't even take my calls. Her father had security walk me out of the building. They took the apartment, Nora, the car, everything. Nora looked at him. She searched herself for a spark of triumph, for that petty, vindictive joy she had imagined in the days immediately following his abandonment. There was nothing, just a hollow, echoing sadness. She wasn't sad for him. She was sad for the girl she used to be, the girl who had thought this man was her entire world. "What do you want, Arthur?" she asked. Her voice wasn't cold. It was just tired. "I made a mistake," he choked out. He took a step forward, and the guard tensed, but Arthur stopped, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. His knuckles were white. "I was stupid. I was so stressed about the money, about our future. I lost my mind. She was an escape hatch. I didn't love her." "That makes it worse," Nora said softly. "You sold us out, and you didn't even have the conviction of love to justify it. You just wanted softer sheets. I missed you," he pleaded, his voice breaking. A tear mixed with the rain on his cheek, tracking through the day-old stubble on his jaw. "I swear to God, Nora, I sat in that massive apartment, and all I could think about was our kitchen, the way you used to hum when you made coffee. I missed us." It was the ultimate insult. He was trying to use their poverty, the very thing he had fled, as a weapon of nostalgia. He was trying to wrap his cowardice in romance. "You didn't miss me, Arthur," Nora said, stepping around the guard so there was nothing between them but the wet pavement. "You missed having someone who looked at you like you were brave. Beatrice looked at you like a pet. I looked at you like a partner. You didn't realize the difference until she put you on a leash." Arthur's face crumpled. He dropped to his knees. The fabric of his jeans soaked up the filthy puddle water on the sidewalk. He reached out, his hands grasping at the empty air near the hem of her coat. "Please," he sobbed, the sound pathetic and wet. "Please, Nora, I have nothing. I don't know what to do. Help me. Just a fraction of what you have. Just enough to start over. I'm begging you." The smell of wet asphalt, exhaust fumes, and his stale cologne mixed in Nora's lungs. She looked down at the top of his head. This was the man she had promised her life to. This was the man who had slid a manila folder across a table and told her she was drowning him. Now, he was kneeling in the dirt, begging for scraps from the empire he had unwittingly handed her. Nora reached into her designer bag. She pulled out a sleek leather wallet. She didn't take out a checkbook. She didn't take out a stack of $100 bills. She unzipped the coin purse section, fished around, and pulled out a single, dull piece of jagged metal. She dropped it. It hit the pavement with a sharp clink, landing right next to Arthur's knee. Arthur stared at it. It was the house key, the one he had left on the kitchen table. "I paid the rent through the end of the month," Nora echoed his words back to him, the irony heavy and dark. "Miller doesn't own the building anymore. The new management is very strict about deadbeats. I suggest you find a job." She turned her back on him, the heavy door of the Maybach closing with a solid, definitive thud, shutting out the sound of his weeping. Revenge, Nora discovered, tasted a lot like distilled water. It was perfectly clear, fundamentally necessary for survival in the short term, and completely devoid of any actual flavor. A week after leaving Arthur kneeling in the November rain, the quiet of her penthouse began to press against her eardrums. The HVAC system hummed with a low, expensive frequency that was designed to be ignored. There were no rattling refrigerator compressors here. No sirens bleeding through thin glass. The silence was absolute, bought and paid for by a man she had never known, maintaining a fortress around a life she didn't yet know how to live. She sat on the edge of a custom-upholstered sofa that cost more than her combined income for the last 3 years. Beside her sat a plate of delicate, untouched crostini prepared by a private chef she felt too guilty to fire. The smell of truffles and aged balsamic vinegar made her stomach turn. She missed the sharp, synthetic bite of cheap cheddar cheese melted over a tortilla in the microwave. She missed the friction of wanting something and having to wait for it. Gable had warned her about this. He called it the capital vacuum. When every material obstacle is removed from your existence, you are left staring directly into the terrifying void of your own internal damage. She stood up, leaving the crostini to grow stale in the climate-controlled air. She stripped off the heavy silk robe she was wearing, the fabric sliding over her skin like cool liquid, and pulled on a pair of the worn, faded denim jeans she had brought from the old apartment. She paired them with an oversized gray sweater. She didn't call the security detail. She didn't alert Gable. She just took the private elevator down to the subterranean garage, bypassed the Maybach, and walked out the side exit into the biting New York afternoon. The subway smelled exactly the same. Hot metal, damp wool, and the faint sour tang of old garbage. It was a chaotic, unbribable ecosystem, and as Nora swiped her newly purchased Metro card, she felt the first genuine expansion of her lungs in weeks. No one looked at her. To the exhausted commuters, she was just another woman with dark circles under her eyes, riding the F train deep into Queens. She got off at her old stop. The wind whipped down the concrete staircase, carrying the familiar scent of roasting nuts and exhaust fumes. She walked 3 blocks, her hands shoved deep into her pockets, until the towering brick facade of the commercial laundry facility loomed into view. The exhaust vents pumped thick, white steam into the gray sky. It smelled of industrial bleach, heavy starch, and damp cotton. It was a suffocating smell, but to Nora, it was the scent of gravity. She pushed through the heavy metal side door. The noise hit her like a physical blow. The rhythmic, deafening clack hiss of the massive ironing presses. The rumble of the 200-pound washing drums spinning at high speed. The air was thick and humid, sticking to her skin instantly. "Hey, you can't be back here unless you're on shift." Nora turned. Brenda was standing near the rolling bins, holding a clipboard. Brenda was 52, had a voice like a diesel engine, and wore her hair in a tight, unyielding bun. She squinted through the steam, her jaw dropping slightly as she recognized the intruder. "Nora?" Brenda lowered the clipboard. She wiped a hand across her sweating forehead, leaving a streak of lint. "Word around the floor was you died, or won the lottery. Miller said your husband broke the lease and you vanished. Something like that," Nora said. She didn't have to shout. She knew how to pitch her voice under the machinery. Brenda looked at her, really looked at her. She took in the clean hair, the lack of dark bags under the eyes, the subtle, unmistakable absence of the grinding panic they all wore on the floor. "You look rested. You didn't come back for your final check, did you? Because HR sent that to the wind." "I don't need the check, Brenda." Nora looked at the massive press where she used to stand for 8 hours a night. The woman working it now looked no older than 20, her shoulders already hunching against the heat. So, why are you here? Brenda asked, leaning against a plastic bin full of damp hotel towels. People who get out don't come back just to breathe the lint. Nora touched the cold metal of a passing laundry cart. The texture was rough, scored by thousands of collisions with concrete walls. I needed to make sure it was still here, that this was real. Brenda snorted, a harsh, practical sound. It's real, honey. The heat still sucks, the pay is still a joke, and my knees still sound like bubble wrap when I stand up. Whatever you got going on out there, she pointed a thick finger toward the exit. Don't look back. You don't owe this place your ghost. Nora nodded slowly. Brenda was right. Standing here, wearing wealth beneath her thrift store clothes, Nora realized she was treating poverty like a museum exhibit. It was an insult to the women still breaking their backs on the floor. Take care of yourself, Brenda, Nora said softly. She walked back out into the cold air. The steam faded from her clothes after a few blocks. She didn't feel healed, but the hollow echo in her chest had quieted. She realized she couldn't buy her way back into her old life, and she couldn't ruthless her way into the new one. The revenge on Arthur had been a dead end. She needed to build a road. Winter dug its claws into the city by late January. The ice on the sidewalks was thick and black with soot. The nonprofit trust Nora had quietly established to manage her old apartment building was making aggressive progress. She sat in the back of the Maybach, reviewing the quarterly report on an iPad. The structural rot had been gutted. The illegal wiring Miller had installed was replaced. The central heating, which had failed every December for a decade, was now a state-of-the-art thermal system. They are requesting final approval on the lobby tile, Gable said from the opposite seat, holding a binder. And there is a matter regarding a ground floor tenant who is consistently late on the subsidized rent. The rent is capped at $500, Nora noted, looking up from her screen. Who is the tenant? Gable hesitated. It was a microsecond of a pause, but Nora caught it. Gable was a machine. Machines didn't hesitate unless the algorithm hit a paradox. A Pauline Trust operates blindly, as you requested. However, the property manager flagged the name during the eviction warning process. It is Arthur Cole. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers pushing away sleet. Nora felt a strange, cold lump form in her throat. She hadn't kept tabs on him. After the night in the alley, she had ordered her security to ensure he didn't approach her, but she hadn't actively tried to ruin his recovery. She had assumed he would crawl back to his logistics firm, beg for a mid-level desk job, and disappear into the gray machinery of corporate America. Instead, he was living in the building she had bought to spite him. He applied through the lottery system the trust set up for low-income applicants, Gable explained quietly. Technically, based on his current documented income, he qualified. He works the graveyard shift at a distribution warehouse in Newark, a distribution warehouse. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. He had traded her for a shipping empire, and now he was loading boxes on the night shift, living in a subsidized studio in the very building he had fled because it felt like a cage. "Do you want the trust to proceed with the eviction?" Gable asked. "He is 3 weeks delinquent." Nora looked out the tinted window. The sleet was turning to snow, heavy, wet flakes sticking to the glass. "Have the driver reroute. Take me to the building." "Nora, I strongly advise against—" "I'm not going to gloat, Richard," she interrupted, her voice tired. "I just need to see it, one last time. Then we close the book." The building looked different. The crumbling brick had been repointed. The broken front door was replaced with heavy, secure glass. The lobby smelled of fresh paint and wet floor wax, a massive improvement from the old scent of stale urine and rotting drywall. Nora walked in alone, leaving the security detail outside in the cold. Her boots clicked against the new porcelain tiles. She found him by the bank of newly installed mailboxes. Arthur was wrestling with a small, jammed metal key. He wore a heavy, safety orange winter coat stained with grease and road salt. His shoulders were slouched, carrying the unmistakable heavy gravity of physical exhaustion. He looked like a man who hadn't slept deeply in months. "You have to pull it slightly toward you as you turn," Nora said. Arthur froze. The sound of his key scraping against the metal stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. He let his head drop, his chin resting against his chest, as if bracing himself for a blow. Slowly, he turned. His face was drawn, the cheekbones sharp beneath a patchy beard. The expensive haircut Beatrice had bought him was long gone, replaced by a ragged, self-administered buzz cut. He looked at Nora. She was wearing a simple black wool coat, no jewelry, her hair loose. She didn't look like a billionaire. She just looked like the woman he used to come home to. "They told me the owner was doing an inspection today," Arthur said. His voice was raspy, stripped of all the polished corporate cadence he used to practice in the mirror. "I didn't know the trust was yours until I saw the new management company's letterhead, Vanguard subsidiary." "I didn't plan this, Arthur," Nora said softly. "I didn't put you here." "I know." He let go of the mailbox key. It dangled from the lock. "I put myself here. The universe just has a really sick sense of humor." He leaned against the wall. He didn't look angry. He just looked thoroughly, completely defeated. "I tried to get a job in an office," he said, staring at the floor. "But Thomas Kensington blacklisted me. Every firm in the city knows I'm toxic waste. So, I load pallets, 12 hours a night. The noise is incredible. It rattles right into your teeth." Nora remembered the laundry presses, the way the sound vibrated in her jaw until she took aspirin just to sleep. She looked at Arthur's hands. The knuckles were scraped, the cuticles torn and stained with industrial grime. He finally had the hands she used to have. "You're behind on your rent," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. Arthur let out a dry, broken laugh. "Yeah, I had to choose between the heating bill and groceries last week. Funny how that works. I guess I'm drowning again." He looked up at her, and for the first time, there was no manipulation in his eyes. No begging. No desperate attempt to leverage their past. It was just the raw, ugly truth of a man who had burned his own house down and was now standing in the ashes, shivering. "I'm sorry, Nora," he whispered. "Not because of the money, not because I got caught. I'm sorry I left you at that table. You didn't deserve that." Nora stood in the brightly lit lobby. She listened to the hum of the new radiators. She smelled the wet wool of his coat. She waited for the vindication to hit her. She waited for the satisfaction of seeing her betrayer thoroughly punished by his own hubris. It never came. Instead, she felt a profound, exhausting wave of closure. The tether that had connected them, first by love, then by struggle, and finally by vengeance, snapped. He wasn't the architect of her misery anymore. He was just a guy in an orange coat trying to survive the winter. "The property manager will wipe the late fees," Nora said quietly. Your rent is paid through the end of the year, from the trust, not from me. Arthur's breath hitched. He closed his eyes, a single tear cutting a track through the grime on his cheek. He didn't say thank you. He knew the charity wasn't an olive branch. It was a severing. Goodbye, Arthur, Nora said. She turned and walked out through the heavy glass doors. She didn't look back to see him pull his mail from the box. She stepped into the snow, the cold air hitting her face, and for the first time since the manila folder slid across her kitchen table, she felt entirely, beautifully light. Spring arrived in New York, not with a cinematic bloom, but with a slow, muddy exhalation. The ice didn't glisten. It turned into gray, gritty slush that pooled at the crosswalks and ruined leather boots. The air carried the complex, conflicting sense of thawing earth, damp garbage, and the faint, promising ozone of early rain. For Nora, the thaw was entirely internal. The transition of Vanguard Holdings was finally complete. She had spent the last 3 months locked in mahogany-paneled rooms, systematically dismantling the most toxic branches of her father's empire. It was brutal, unpopular work. She remembered sitting at the head of the Vanguard boardroom just a week prior. The room had smelled of lemon polish, stale espresso, and the acrid sweat of nervous men in $5,000 suits. She had been staring at a thick, cream-colored contract that would liquidate her father's rare earth mining division. It was an incredibly profitable arm of the portfolio. It also relied on labor practices in the global south that made a tight, nauseating knot form at the base of Nora's throat. If we divest now, we take a 40% haircut on the valuation, a senior board member had argued, his silk tie perfectly dimpled. He hadn't looked at Nora. He had spoken to the spreadsheet projected on the wall, as if the numbers were the only adults in the room. Sell it, Nora had said. Her voice didn't waver. It didn't need to. Ms. Cole, the fiduciary responsibility we hold. I own the controlling shares. Sell it. She had signed the paper. The heavy gold nib of the Mont Blanc pen had scratched against the thick cardstock, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed in the quiet room. It was the sound of $1 billion vaporizing. As she signed, she had felt a phantom ache in her lower back, a ghost of the pain from standing at the industrial laundry press for 10 hours straight. She had traded $1 billion for a clean conscience and a full night's sleep. It felt like an absolute steal. Now, 2 weeks later, the air tasted of salt and diesel exhaust. The Maybach idled next to a cracked concrete curb in deep Brooklyn. Nora stepped out, her heavy boots sinking half an inch into a puddle of stagnant, iridescent water. She didn't flinch. She was wearing a thick canvas chore coat over a black turtleneck, her hair pulled back in a messy knot. Gable followed her out of the car, stepping gingerly to protect his polished Oxfords from the sludge. They were standing in front of a cavernous, abandoned warehouse. It was a cathedral of industrial decay. The massive corrugated steel doors shrieked in protest as the security detail hauled them open, revealing a gaping black maw. Inside, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The air was thick and heavy, laden with chalky concrete dust, the sharp, coppery tang of oxidized iron, and the undeniable, sour musk of pigeon guano. The structural integrity holds, Gable said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He was reading from a tablet that glowed unnaturally bright in the gloom. But the environmental remediation alone will take 6 months. The soil beneath the foundation is heavily contaminated with decades of machine oil and chemical runoff. Dig it up, Nora said. She walked toward the center of the massive room. Her footsteps crunched over broken glass and loose gravel. Scrape it down to the bedrock if you have to. Pour new concrete. She looked up. The skylights were caked with black grime, but a few thin blades of pale afternoon sunlight managed to slice through the dirt, illuminating swirling, chaotic motes of dust in the air. The zoning board is going to fight the commercial to educational reclassification tooth and nail, Gable warned, wiping a smudge of rust from his lapel with a monogrammed linen handkerchief. They want luxury residential lofts here. The developer lobby in this district is incredibly aggressive. Let them be aggressive, Nora replied, running a hand along a massive, rusted steel I-beam. The rough, peeling texture flaked off against her skin, leaving an orange stain on her palm. We have an unlimited legal fund, Richard. Bury them in injunctions until they beg us to build. Nora wasn't building a museum. She wasn't financing a modern art wing with her name etched in frosted glass to impress people she despised. She was building a trade academy. She remembered the sheer, suffocating terror of a blown head gasket on her old sedan. She remembered the way a single $400 plumbing bill could dictate whether she ate anything besides boiled rice for an entire month. People on the edge didn't need more abstract philanthropy. They needed leverage. They needed the hard, calloused, tangible skills that actually kept the city from collapsing in on itself. Plumbers, electricians, HVAC technicians, heavy machinery operators. The curriculum will be entirely subsidized, Nora said, turning to face Gable in the cavernous gloom. We pay the students a living stipend while they learn. Nobody should have to work a 12-hour night shift just to afford their daytime classes. I want the finest instructors in the state, and I want a fully stocked tool room. Gable sighed, a quiet, highly structured exhalation of breath. It's a massive black hole for capital, Nora. There is zero financial return on investment here. The return, Nora countered, her voice dropping to a fierce, quiet register, is that fewer people will be forced to tolerate being treated like disposable garbage because they have nowhere else to go. That is the only return I care about. Gable nodded slowly, adjusting his glasses. He knew when a door was closed. We need to assemble a board of directors for the foundation. Thomas Kensington's charitable trust reached out yesterday. Several other high society patrons are willing to attach their names and networks to the project. It would buy us immense political goodwill. Absolutely not. The word snapped through the cold air like a whip. No socialites, no people who wear cashmere to cut ribbons and hold oversized checks. A foundation of this size requires stringent oversight. I have oversight in mind. Nora wiped the rust from her hands onto the thighs of her jeans. Call the commercial laundry facility in Queens. Ask for the night shift floor manager. Her name is Brenda. Gable froze. His thumb hovered paralyzed over his tablet screen. You want to put a laundry manager on a 9-figure educational foundation board? I want her to chair it, Nora corrected, a genuine, unpolished smile breaking across her face. Offer her triple her current salary, full premium benefits, a dedicated driver, whatever it takes to get her off that floor. Nora, she has absolutely no experience in nonprofit governance or fund allocation. She runs a floor of 50 exhausted, underpaid people in 110-degree heat without a single strike or safety violation in a decade, Nora said, stepping closer to Gable, her eyes burning with conviction. She can spot a liar at 50 paces, and she doesn't give a damn about anyone's fragile ego. That's exactly the governance I want. She knows what a broken system smells like, and she won't let us build one. Gable stared at her for a long moment. The rigid corporate resistance slowly drained out of his posture, replaced by a reluctant, profound respect. I will draft the offer letter immediately. Nora turned away from him and walked toward the massive open bay doors. She stopped on the threshold, caught exactly between the freezing, dusty shadow of the warehouse and the pale, muddy spring sunlight outside. She closed her eyes. For the past year, she had been carrying the ghosts of her old life like heavy stones in her pockets. The metallic clink of the deadbolt when Arthur walked out. The smell of cold toner on the divorce papers. The terrified, sweaty look on his face at the gala. The pathetic, wet sound of his sobbing in the alleyway. She realized, standing there in the cold air, that the noise in her head had finally stopped. The ghosts had packed up and left. She didn't feel the burning, acidic need to prove anything to Arthur, or to Beatrice, or to the phantom memory of the father who had left her this empire. Revenge had been a blunt instrument that had only bruised her own hands. But this heavy, rusted steel, this contaminated dirt, this massive, impossible, grueling project. This was an anchor. She opened her eyes, inhaling the sharp, brine-scented wind blowing off the river. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't just a billionaire's heir playing dress-up in boardrooms. She was the architect of her own gravity, and she was finally ready to build. Sometimes the hardest part of surviving betrayal isn't the fall. It's figuring out who you are when you finally stand back up. Nora didn't find peace in destroying the man who broke her. She found it in building something he could never understand. Wealth didn't erase her past, but it gave her the power to ensure no one else had to endure the same grind. True revenge isn't about making them bleed. It's about making their absence irrelevant. If this story hit home for you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own worth. And don't forget to subscribe for more raw human stories every week. Drop a comment below. What would you do with a second chance?